Exactly 3 minutes after the judge's gavel fell to finalize my divorce, a single phone call to my mother initiated a corporate execution that completely wiped my ex-husband's family legacy off the commercial map before dinner. My father-in-law had spent 4 meticulous years running a highly covert corporate espionage ring inside our multi-million-dollar logistics firm, entirely unaware that his greed had structured his own financial downfall. By the time he arrived at my private residence that evening, screaming and demanding full operational control of our core assets, he didn't realize that all 28 of his hidden moles had already been permanently logged into a federal fraud registry. My name is Clara Vance. For the past 6 years, I have served as the Chief Operating Officer of Vance Global Logistics, a premier supply chain and shipping enterprise founded entirely by my mother, Evelyn Vance, after my father passed away. We built this company from a local courier service into a dominant regional powerhouse, handling over $40 million in annual commercial freight. But 4 years ago, I made the catastrophic mistake of marrying Julian Mercer, a superficially charming corporate consultant whose family operated a struggling, deeply indebted mid-tier manufacturing plant. From the very moment the wedding registry was signed, Julian's father, Malcolm Mercer, viewed our expanding logistics infrastructure not as an allied entity, but as a host organism designed to be slowly consumed from the inside out. The marriage itself was an absolute psychological trap. Julian utilized continuous emotional manipulation, gaslighting, and manufactured domestic crises to keep me mentally exhausted and distracted from the core day-to-day operations of the corporate office. While I was isolated at home dealing with his toxic behavior, Malcolm was quietly executing a highly malicious, long-term infiltration strategy. Utilizing his position as a trusted extended family member, he recommended, vetted, and pushed for the strategic hiring of 28 specific individuals across our most critical operational sectors, including senior data compliance, warehouse inventory routing, and digital payroll infrastructure. To us, these individuals appeared to be highly qualified independent professionals. In reality, they were a highly coordinated network of corporate spies whose loyalty belonged entirely to the Mercer family pipeline. The baseline of their strategy was absolute structural sabotage. Over a 24-month period, our firm began experiencing highly unusual operational leaks. Proprietary shipping routes were mysteriously acquired by competitors. Premium client bidding data was consistently undercut by fractions of a cent, and our central supply chain software suffered continuous, unexplainable administrative delays. Because the 28 plants occupied key middle management positions, they skillfully redirected the corporate blame toward our loyal long-term employees, slowly isolating my mother and I within our own executive suite. They were systematically draining Vance Global Logistics' market value, preparing the groundwork for Malcolm to stage a hostile, predatory corporate takeover the moment our valuation dropped below a critical threshold. The ultimate breakthrough occurred when I discovered an encrypted data mirroring application active on Julian's personal laptop during a brief weekend stay at our private estate. He had left his professional profile open, exposing a central cloud database where all 28 planted employees were uploading daily activity logs, client manifests, and proprietary financial algorithms directly to Malcolm Mercer's private server. The revelation hit me with absolute freezing clarity. My entire marriage had been a cold, calculated commercial transaction designed to grant the Mercer family unhindered entry into our life's work. I didn't confront Julian, I didn't scream, and I didn't give them a single warning sign that their network had been completely exposed. Instead, I quietly downloaded the entire encrypted database onto a secure, offline storage drive and walked straight to the top corporate divorce and white-collar defense attorneys in the metropolitan area. We spent 6 months building an airtight, multi-layered legal strategy. I filed for an immediate divorce based on absolute, irreconcilable fraud and asset dissipation, keeping the corporate espionage evidence entirely hidden from the standard family court proceedings to prevent Malcolm from pulling his assets out of the jurisdiction. The absolute climax of the strategy materialized on the morning of July 10, 2026, inside the Central Family Court Registry. Julian and his high-prized legal team sat across the mahogany table wearing smug, arrogant expressions, firmly believing that the divorce settlement would grant them a massive portion of my personal corporate shares or a heavy multi-million-dollar liquid payout. They had no idea that I had already signed over my entire voting stock back to my mother's private trust weeks prior. The moment the judge signed the final decree and officially declared me a free agent, I stepped out into the marble corridor, unlocked my phone, and called my mother immediately. "Mom, it's done," I stated, my voice completely cold and razor-sharp. "Execute the protocol. Fire all 28 employees my in-laws planted in the company right now. Do not allow them to touch a single keyboard." Evelyn was already standing inside our central IT command center with a team of elite corporate security guards and independent cyber forensics analysts. Within 90 seconds, a synchronized company-wide termination protocol was executed across every single regional branch. The digital access keys, email accounts, and security badges of all 28 moles were instantaneously deactivated. Before they could even comprehend what was happening, uniform-clad private security officers walked onto the corporate floors, handed them their finalized termination notices alongside pre-drafted federal non-disclosure violations, and escorted them out of the buildings into the public street. The cyber team immediately seized their hardware, locking down every single byte of mirror data before a single file could be corrupted or deleted. Thank God I acted with that level of instantaneous precision, because that very same evening, the underlying rage of the Mercer family completely boiled over. I was sitting in the quiet, dimly lit living room of my private home when the front security gates were violently rattled. Malcolm Mercer came bursting through the perimeter walkway, his face twisted in absolute fury, pounding on my glass door. Julian followed closely behind him, looking completely pale and panicked. The moment I opened the door, keeping the security chain firmly engaged, Malcolm began screaming at the top of his lungs, his voice echoing across the suburban neighborhood. He demanded that I immediately reverse the terminations, arrogantly declaring that I was destroying a highly profitable family alliance. He yelled that those 28 individuals were the absolute operational backbone of the logistics firm, threatening that if I didn't reinstate them with full managerial access by 8 a.m. the following morning, he would utilize his industry connections to completely bankrupt our shipping routes and tie my mother up in civil litigation for the next decade. He truly believed he still held the psychological upper hand, completely oblivious to the fact that his entire empire was already balancing on the edge of a blade. I stood on the porch, looking at my former father-in-law with an expression of complete, unyielding detachment. I didn't argue with him, and I didn't match his explosive energy. I simply unlocked my tablet screen and turned it toward his face, displaying a live digital tracking notification from the Federal Trade Commission and the State Bureau of White-Collar Compliance. "Malcolm, you are completely miscalculating your current position," I said, my voice carrying an icy, unshakable finality. Those 28 individuals weren't just terminated for an HR violation. They were removed because the forensic data packages I submitted to the Federal Compliance Board this morning explicitly trace 4 years of systemic data theft, corporate espionage, and interstate wire fraud directly to your manufacturing firm's IP addresses. The authorities aren't coming to mediate a family dispute. They are currently processing a multi-million-dollar asset seizure against your entire enterprise. The arrogant color completely drained from Malcolm's face, his mouth opening slightly as he stepped back onto the concrete stairs. Julian looked at his father in absolute horror, realizing for the very first time that their multi-year covert operation had been entirely co-opted and turned into a trap. The global financial system moves with a brutal, automated speed when corporate espionage is verified. Because Van's Global Logistics handled critical regional supply lines, the federal compliance units treated the data breach as a high-priority structural threat. By the early hours of the next morning, the ripple effects of my legal delivery began to fracture the foundational roots of the Mercer family's lifestyle. I stood by my kitchen counter, watching the high-definition security feeds broadcast the quiet darkness of my perimeter. My phone remained silent on the marble surface, its primary communication lanes entirely locked down, while my corporate terminal recorded a cascade of desperate, automated alert pings from the Mercer corporate domains. They were realizing that the internal network they had spent 48 months weaving inside my company had not only been completely severed, but had been turned into a digital net that was pulling their own assets into a federal repository. At exactly 9 a.m., federal white-collar compliance units, backed by state asset recovery officers, arrived at the main corporate gates of Mercer Manufacturing. They didn't arrive to request an administrative audit or hold a preliminary discussion. They carried an absolute, non-negotiable federal asset freeze warrant signed by a chief magistrate. Every single mainframe computer, external data drive, and internal accounting ledger was systematically cataloged and loaded into secure transit vehicles. Within 45 minutes, the entire physical and digital framework of their manufacturing operation was placed under an ironclad state lock, preventing a single dollar from being moved out of their corporate treasury. The destruction didn't limit itself to their commercial holdings. Because Malcolm had used his family's primary real estate holdings and luxury vehicles as secondary capital guarantees to secure their operational lines of credit, the sudden freeze triggered an automated cross-default sequence across their personal banking lines. By noon, Julian's elite platinum credit lines and private accounts were completely deactivated by the central banking servers. The luxury sedan he drove, which was leased through a corporate subsidiary of his father's firm, was flagged for immediate repossession by the vendor, leaving him physically stranded at his attorney's downtown office. As the afternoon progressed, the 28 terminated moles began to collapse under the immense weight of federal legal pressure. Faced with decades of potential sentences for industrial espionage, trade secret theft, and organized wire fraud, their engineered loyalty to Malcolm Mercer completely evaporated. By 3 p.m., 16 of the primary plants had already signed comprehensive state depositions, turning state's evidence in exchange for immunity. They provided the regional prosecutor with detailed electronic records, cash payment receipts, and direct text message logs from Malcolm explicitly detailing how he had paid them under-the-table bonuses to alter our shipping algorithms and siphon our client lists. The internal betrayal they had cultivated against my mother and me had become the exact instrument that ensured their own permanent downfall. Malcolm was formally arrested at his suburban residence that evening, his hands secured by state marshals as local media outlets captured the stunning collapse of one of the region's most established manufacturing legacies. The image of the arrogant patriarch being escorted into a government vehicle was broadcast across every business channel in the city, permanently destroying whatever remaining social or commercial capital the Mercer name possessed. Julian attempted to bypass my security parameters one final time, appearing outside my corporate headquarters 3 days after the initial raids. He stood in the heavily guarded glass lobby of Van's Global Logistics, his expensive designer suit looking crumpled and worn, his face completely devoid of the mocking confidence he had used to control our marriage. When my executive protection team allowed him to step into the secure boardroom, he looked at my mother and me with an expression of pure, unmitigated desperation. He realized that the quiet, patient woman he had spent years isolating had completely erased his family's footprint from the economic grid. "Clara, please, you have to talk to the federal prosecutors," Julian stammered, his voice cracking as he gripped the edge of the polished oak table. "My father is facing 20 years without the possibility of an administrative bond. The bank has taken full possession of the manufacturing plant, and our personal accounts are completely cleared. I have been forced to lease a single-room apartment in the industrial district just to avoid total homelessness. We were family, Clara. How can you sit there with this level of calculating coldness and watch us lose everything?" 4 years ago, your father stood in this exact room and smiled as he shook my mother's hand, while his hidden network was already actively siphoning the marrow out of our life's work. You treated our marriage as a long-term commercial heist and mistook my patience for complete passivity. I did not engineer your destruction, Julian. I merely pulled back the curtain and allowed the absolute gravity of your own systemic fraud to crush your family legacy. The contract is over. I gave a silent nod to the uniform-clad security operators standing by the door, and without another single word permitted, Julian Mercer was permanently escorted out of our corporate infrastructure. I walked over to the expansive glass windows of our executive office, looking out at the massive fleet of Vance Global Logistics trucks moving seamlessly out of the shipping bays, their routes secure and their digital frameworks completely protected. My former family had spent years operating under the delusion that greed, psychological manipulation, and hidden infiltration could permanently replace the foundation of true human labor and building. They tried to use a sacred bond to destroy a fortress from the inside out, but they ended up learning a devastating, permanent lesson. When you try to harvest a legacy that doesn't belong to you, the walls will always drop and the wreckage will be entirely your own.